This is Gunbuster, a fast-paced, boss-crushing, cyberpunk-inspired, gunslinging first-person shooter created by none other than Taito. It appeared exclusively in arcades starting in the summer of 1992 and offers players full freedom of movement in a pseudo-3D world. It also released the same year as id Software's groundbreaking Wolfenstein 3D, and is in some ways somewhat of an anomaly. It's a game developed at a time when the first-person shooter was still in its infancy, meaning there were no standards nor expectations. Developers were still defining what it meant to play in first person, and Taito's attempt represents something entirely unique. Using a joystick paired with a mounted light gun, Gunbuster features controls very much in the spirit of a modern shooter. Move and strafe with the joystick, aim with the gun. It even supports full co-op and networked deathmatch. So yeah, it was very much ahead of its time. Which is why in this special edition of DF Retro, I wanted to take you on a journey through the world of Gunbuster and the era that surrounded it. The slick combination of huge sprites and tile maps resulted in a game that looks wholly unlike anything else in the genre. In this video, we'll explore its unique visual design and gameplay mechanics, while also examining the state of the gaming industry at the time of release. I'll even demonstrate how you can play the game right now with a mouse and keyboard on your PC. Got it? Let's bust some guns. "1992 was a banner year for video games, arguably one of the most pivotal in the history of the medium. It was the year that Capcom released Street Fighter II, the year Mario and friends took their first laps in Super Mario Kart, and the year Sonic the Hedgehog got his first sequel. It was also the year of Virtua Racing, Sega's first foray into the world of 3D polygonal graphics, and the year Midway upset parents and congressmen alike with Mortal Kombat. That's not even getting into the arrival of the Sega CD in the West, the release of the third Legend of Zelda game, Dragon Quest V in Japan, and even Kirby's very first entry on the Game Boy. If it isn't already obvious, 1992 is a year when the medium of games began to grow and change in new and unexpected ways. It represents the peak of 2D pixel art, the rise of 3D graphics, and the maturation of the compact disc as a storage medium. Not to mention the arrival and growth of many franchises that remain popular to this day. And then there was Wolfenstein 3D. Featuring fast-paced, Nazi-blasting action paired with cutting-edge 3D technology, Wolfenstein changed the game. Sure, id Software had already made a name for itself in the world of PC gaming by this point, but with the release of Wolfenstein, id Software kicked down the figurative door and transformed the PC gaming landscape forever. Suddenly, the PC became the place to go for fast-paced 3D action in your home. Now, of course, it wasn't the first action game to embrace the first-person perspective, but it was the game that would ignite the imaginations of players and developers everywhere. Wolfenstein 3D effectively established the first-person shooter genre and created the framework upon which future games, including id Software's own Doom, would build. But at the time of its release, there were no rules. It was, by all accounts, the Wild West. And this descriptor is rather fitting in this case, as it was a genre primarily driven by Western developers. That's how it was perceived at the time anyways, but that doesn't mean that Japanese developers, the masters of the pixel at this time, weren't also interested in exploring this perspective as well. As it turns out, Taito had some of their own ideas, and Gunbuster is the result, a game that almost feels like an alternate timeline variation of a classic first-person shooter. The concept, you assume the role of a futuristic bounty hunter taking on jobs across a range of missions. Armed with a joystick in your left hand and a mounted light gun in your right, you'll maneuver in full 3D across 7 stages on the way to the finale. At certain junctions, you're given the opportunity to select from a pair of missions, making each playthrough slightly different as well. almost Darius-like in terms of progression, another Taito classic. The thing is, when you step back and consider the controls in use here, Gunbuster feels unusually forward-looking. Assigning movement to one hand and looking/aiming to the other is basically the industry standard today, but in 1992, no such thing really existed, at least not quite like this. I mean, most players of Wolfenstein were happy to embrace the cursor keys laid out towards the bottom edge of their keyboards, right? The idea of circle strafing and aiming was still very, very new. Yet, here's Gunbuster offering exactly that, all the way back in '92. Of course, given that you're aiming with a gun peripheral, it doesn't exactly mimic a mouse. Rather, using a bounding box, you move a cursor to the edge of the screen, turning when you reach that edge. It works exactly like a game that might be designed for Nintendo's Wii pointer system some 14 years later. That being said, as forward-looking as the controls may be, the game itself is rather distinct from Wolfenstein and those that would follow. That is, your objective in each mission is to assassinate a boss enemy. It's basically a series of boss battles. You'll be dropped into one of 13 small arenas and tasked with taking out said boss along with any minions that might stand in your way. What it lacks in terms of exploration, however, it more than makes up for with over-the-top set-piece design. The opening mission serves as a training ground, for instance. You're dropped into a small glass-encased elevator ascending a skyscraper while a jetpack-equipped boss flies around just outside the window. You blast right through the glass while learning the basics of the controls until he's finally eliminated. Mission 2 then drops you into an outdoor arena with a fenced-off section here in the middle. You'll move and strafe around, avoiding enemy fire while slowly chipping away at your foe and learning more about the game mechanics. But it's Mission 3 that begins to demonstrate what the game is truly capable of. Taking place in a slightly expanded environment, you'll maneuver in and around this office area. Here, nearly everything can be destroyed. Huge explosions rock your view as you slowly chip away at your foes. It's extremely immersive. And that's just the beginning. Other missions include an assault on the open sea, a high-speed jet bike chase complete with shifting times of day, and even a rooftop battle set during a thunderstorm. Each one of these scenarios cranks the intensity level up to 11. Imagine any cool cyber-fueled action sequence and it's probably in here. Even today, the sheer variety and scope of these sequences is truly impressive. Heck, you can even play the game entirely in co-op, or if you have a deluxe machine, it's possible to engage in deathmatch, making this one of the earliest examples of land-based deathmatch gameplay. But here's the crazy thing, Gunbuster is entirely built from sprites and tile maps. So, to better understand why this is interesting, let's consider our options for 3D graphics in '92. High-end arcade machines such as Sega's Model 1 and Namco's Polygonizer board were developed for full 3D polygon graphics, right? This would become the standard going forward, but rendering such polygons was still way too expensive for home machines, at least at a smooth frame rate. In Wolfenstein, and in fact their earlier attempts at first-person action, John Carmack used raycasting instead, a process used to display 3D graphics derived from a 2D source basically. It shoots out a ray from the player's perspective to determine the distance of a wall from the player and how high to draw it based on that distance. And it was fast enough that even lower end PCs at the time could still enjoy the game. Gunbuster, on the other hand, uses a well-worn but still rather flexible technique, sprite scaling. That's right, every enemy, every object, and every wall is made up of sprites. And thanks to the sheer amount of ROM data available to the arcade board manufacturers, artists are able to create a huge selection of sprites to represent all the different possible angles from which players might view an object. For instance, if you remember in Doom, when you circle strafe around a dead imp, that sprite will always face you. But it doesn't need to be that way. You see, in this game, as you rotate, it actually swaps in different sprites at various intervals to simulate these different angles. My favorite example has to be the elevator. Note how as the game swaps in different sprites for the glass walls representing different angles, certain angles have an actual pixel glare painted right into the sprite to simulate the glossiness of the surface. Pure artistry at work. In some stages, even the floor consists of these stacked sprites. It's crazy stuff, but it actually looks pretty good. Now granted, none of this was exactly new. Sega had been using similar techniques since the mid-80s, but 1988's Galaxy Force, which would get a deluxe version as Galaxy Force 2, really showcases what you can do with it, by simulating full 3D spaces comprised entirely from sprites. For Taito though, the road to Gunbuster actually begins back in 1987 with the release of the Taito Z System arcade board, featuring a Motorola 68000 CPU paired with a custom graphics processor. The Z System was capable of displaying and scaling a large number of sprites, all the way up to 128 by 128 pixels in size, along with multiple scrolling tile map layers and other things as well. This board powered arcade classics like 1988's Chase HQ with its fast-paced, Outrun-inspired driving antics, the super impressive Night Striker, which is Taito's take on the Space Harrier formula set against a futuristic Cyber City backdrop, and even things like Aqua Jack, which kinda sorta resembles what I'd imagine a Nightboat arcade game might look like.
Faster, Nightboat! We've got to catch those starfish poachers!
You don't have to yell, Michael. I'm all around you. Oh no, they're headed for land.
We'll never catch them now.
Incorrect. Look, a canal.
More importantly, it also powered a game called Space Gun. In Space Gun, you and a friend grab a mounted machine gun and take on hordes of enemies across multiple stages. This is an on-rail shooter, which means the camera moves through each stage almost as if it were a 3D world, yet everything is still built up of sprites and tiles. I love this little detail. If you shoot out the glass windows, a metal gate comes slamming down to seal the compartment off. So in that sense, it almost feels like the designers of Gunbuster looked at Space Gun and said, but what if you could move around freely? And coincidentally, one of the lead designers and some of the programming staff worked on both games, so maybe there really is a commonality here. But of course, achieving this goal required just a little more hardware power, and thus the Taito SZ system was born. This one is powered by the new 32-bit Motorola 68020 processor and even more powerful graphics hardware. Gunbuster was the first arcade game released on this board, and it immediately shows much more flexibility in terms of object handling. Of course, this board would go on to power a whole host of other sprite scaling games, including the impressive Galactic Storm, which kinda sorta resembles Sega's Galaxy Force, the fast-paced Ground Effects, a sprite-based Formula 1 racing game, and Super Chase, a 1993 semi-first-person sequel to Chase HQ and its sequel SCI. The thing is, even with the rise of polygon graphics, there's still something special about games that relied on sprite scaling. The sheer volume of handcrafted pixel art effortlessly shuffling around the screen at a blistering 60 frames per second is just too difficult to ignore. It's beautiful stuff. Gunbuster manages to throw around a huge number of sprites with ease and has special hardware specifically designed to facilitate this. I'm using MAME here to show off the game, of course, but I have played this on an original cabinet years ago, and the performance in MAME mirrors that of the real thing. It's a blistering smooth 60 frames per second. Just seeing this game in action, I can't help but wonder what might have been possible with this method of rendering 3D environments had continued just a little longer. Perhaps the sheer volume of artwork required to pull this off is simply too heavy on resources, though I'm kinda reminded of the Sega Saturn's method for displaying 3D. Remember that Tomb Raider video I produced a few years ago? Yeah, this is what you get if you unwarp the objects used to build the world. It actually seems to rely on distorted sprites, which is kinda reminiscent of Gunbuster. Obviously, the future of 3D would rely primarily on 3D polygons, but still, I love this kind of stuff. Now, beyond the visuals, as a Taito game, you can expect a high-quality soundscape thanks to the power of Zuntata, Taito's in-house band. Like many other Taito games, Gunbuster uses a pair of Ensoniq audio chips that support up to 32 voices. This allows for complex music playback mixed with overlapping sound effects galore. It sounds great. Actually, if you'll permit me to switch gears here for a moment, I'd like to showcase some of the other great work from Zuntata during this era. Taito's collection of talented musicians always focused on creating a unique atmospheric sound that was completely unlike anything else being produced, and I really want to highlight it. So buckle up for a little Zuntata montage. Okay, so you've made it this far in the video. You've seen the game, you survived the montage, and now you want to try it. Well, you're in luck. MAME offers excellent support for Gunbuster. Sure, it still lacks LAN play, and the sound emulation isn't flawless, but the experience is otherwise complete, and as I mentioned earlier, you can play it with a mouse and keyboard. So how does that work? Well, you simply pop up the control configuration menu in MAME and map the X and Y movement of the gun reticle to your mouse. Then configure the 4 joystick directions to WSAD, map the rest of your buttons to the mouse, and that's it. It's really that simple. Once set up, you can move the in-game cursor just like a mouse cursor, and it functions as intended, with rotation occurring when the cursor moves out of the bounding box. Using WSAD, you can of course walk around the environment and strafe. It feels surprisingly modern, almost like an indie game you might find on Steam even. So yeah, Gunbuster may not have directly influenced the future of gaming like Wolfenstein or Doom, but it's an interesting curiosity, I think. A short 20-minute arcade-style game that's fast, stylish, and most importantly, fun. It perfectly encapsulates the essence of Taito circa 1992. Taito was all about trying fresh new ideas, and I love them for it. It's just great to see such an early game touching on so many aspects of the FPS genre well before it was established. Given that, I highly recommend checking it out. That's it for this special episode of DF Retro, however. Be sure to let me know what you think. With this episode, I'm testing out the idea of producing shorter episodes in between the multi-hour epics you might have come to expect. The next king-size episode of DF Retro is going to cover the entire Road Rash series, so look out for that. For now though, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.